Hey everyone, as you will see in chapter 3 of Tilly's book on collective violence, it talks about coding for political violence. This is very important, and I'm going to show you something later on guerrilla warfare, which is very, very important. But there's something about this chapter. Now, we don't always have to love the book, right? Oh, the book. You got to love the book because he's a big star, that Tilly, even bigger than me. He's at Columbia, one of the biggest professors in the United States on collective violence. Is he bigger than me, though? Yes, very much bigger. The problem is, notice he talks about the CIA's database and all this stuff on terrorist incidents. Notice how he talks about a man named Gurr, how he codes like 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a common, and then you make it what we call machine readable. Essentially, you take, right, acts of violence and you can code for them like severe, small, etc. The problem with that is, notice that he talks about the New York Times, notice that he talks about everything when we do collective violence. Do you think there are other languages, other intersubjective understandings of the world? Yes. Yes, there are. And this is what problem is, that you then have a US centric view of the world on political violence and terrorism. That's problematic. As you'll see in the movie, the United States was the one in El Salvador supporting the death squads and the unfortunate, lamentable sexual attack and death, murder of the nuns. They also, the government we supported killed Archbishop Romero. They also killed just a broad range of different actors. The government was brutal. And we continue to do the same thing over and over. But so does Russia, so does China, so does all countries, right? We have the tendency to support our allies and, and ignore their human rights abuses and then magnify those. If you look at what's going on with the Palestinian crisis, all of those people who have been killed, right? Children, women, etc., the trauma moving them. Now we're going to have a debate on this, right? But the question is, if that was not an ally, how would we be coding for this? How would we be describing it, interpret it, etc.? That's why, if you've taken me before, you always know I talk about an intersubjective understanding of the world. What is a terrorist depends on where you sit. The University of Maryland has a terrorist data set, and a good friend of mine is actually in it, Dora Maria Diaz, which is problematic because she helped overthrow a man named Somoza. And then later, she fought against Daniel Ortega in hunger strikes and things like that. She was in prison, she was tortured, etc. This is extremely problematic because the idea of what terrorism is basically subjective. And when we start talking about collective violence, etc., we have to understand that the United States has its friends, the United States has its allies, Russia has its allies. So Russia will ignore the human rights abuses and say Belarus, right? Under Lukashenko, you don't want to stand up to that guy. But then we have allies like Equatorial Guinea, and we support the most brutal dictator, Teodoro Obiang, in this archipelago state. It's actually an African state, but the oil is off the coast in what was the capital. He's been around since 1979. So the problem here is that, what is political violence and how we code for it? We need more voices, more languages, more information. The article you're going to read on mine on how do we code for political violence, you'll see that although the government of Venezuela has been brutal, the more recent one, so has the protesters. In fact, the protesters burnt alive the Cuban doctors that was sent there. And the Cuban doctors are popular in Latin America because even Enrique Capriles was running against Maduro. That's the president of, or the dictator, depends on where you stand, of Venezuela, conceded that they were popular and wanted to give them citizenship. So, the protesters are very violent sometimes, and we ignore this violence, as you'll see in the Colombian uh, uh, video and stuff like that. Like this person behind me. When I was a professor at La Universidad Centroamericana in Nicaragua, they used to go out on these protests, which you saw, and this is a mortero, and he's holding it. I've held it, and they fight the anti-motines with this. Those are the riot squads. You see this kind of behavior all throughout. These university students, maybe a student of mine, go out and fight, etc. For what reasons, as we talked about before. But this is collective violence. But when we talk about collective violence, I want you to understand, right? Number one, we have the tendency to highlight the violence of our quote unquote enemies and downplay the violence of our allies. So what you just saw recently when an opposition figure was killed, I mean, let's face it, in prison in Russia because he opposes Putin. I mean, I have no doubt that he was killed. The same thing goes with the leader of the Wagner group, right? Who, whose plane went down. Wow. I mean, obviously these people are being killed. I don't doubt that. However, we're just using human rights because we don't like Putin, but this happens a lot in states we do support, Swaziland, Equatorial Guinea. We could go on and on. So Swaziland is also a African nation that has a king and like 25 wives. I refer to him as the Jeffrey Epstein of Africa. So the problem here is people have the tendency to essentially ignore these things. So you look at the person behind me, is he a terrorist or is he a freedom fighter? That is key to understanding collective violence. And the problem too, when we get into diplomacy, is you're sooner or later going to have to sit down with these people who you think are quote unquote terrorists and sooner or later negotiate. It's very, very difficult to just kill everyone. And I mean, look at Japan, look at Germany. I mean, we have great relations with Germany. Years ago, they were a crazy Nazi regime and we bombed them, Dresden. The Soviets went in and killed a lot of people too in Germany, got their just desserts according to the Soviets at the time. But this is something we have to talk about with collective violence. To what extent do we really report all the violence? And if we fail to, do we understand the full situation on the ground?